Hello, everybody. We're just starting up. I'm here with my friend Kevin Fiscus. Kevin, I'm going to barely introduce you. I'm just going to say a few words. You got some stuff up
Mhm.
on the screen. You can introduce yourself better. I've known Kevin for 20 years. I don't know,
It's been a while.
a very long time. We hadn't seen each other in quite a while with a pandemic and so forth. And was it a little less than a year ago? I think 8 months
Yeah,
or
at
something.
Amsterdam.
We spent a week together in Amsterdam. Had a wonderful time.
Yep.
Did some great work there together. We were not there just to enjoy ourselves, but it's a wonderful, pretty, beautiful walking city. You always have some interesting things to say. You don't just have the standard viewpoint of this is what I've learned and this is what I think that everyone else says. You always have some interesting insights, ways of looking things, ways of tackling problems that we have. And I know I'm going to learn some things from you. Even once years ago, you gave like a 5 or 10 minute talk somewhere, like a quick Nmap demo. And Nmap something I've used for, I don't know, since they wrote it. And I was like, I learned a couple things. Like I didn't know it did that. So with
Very
no
cool.
further ado, Kevin, why don't you take it away?
Awesome. Thank you, Ted. I appreciate it. Yeah, that trip to Amsterdam was a lot of fun. I appreciate you introducing me to some really nice adult beverage establishments. We had some fantastic cocktails and things like that. So some amazing food and obviously the companionship was awesome. Enjoyed that week thoroughly. So and I appreciate the intro. I truly do hope that everybody does come away from this with maybe a modified perspective on how security is actually operating. And I'm really looking at this from sort of a security strategy or a security architecture perspective. Just for those of you who may be interested, there's a bunch of notes on the slide. I've been in the IT industry for when I look at it, I'm like, I can't be that old, but 33 years. 22 years of that spent very focused on information security. I spend a lot of time focusing on things like cyber deception, but I do have a background in both sort of offensive and defensive operations. So kind of red and blue team type of stuff. I collect industry certifications. I'm trying to get one of every letter of the alphabet after my name.
That would be amazing.
The problem is it stalls out pretty quickly, right? Like there's just some things in there. But so just a little bit of a background about myself. And so I guess with no further ado, I'm going to jump into statistics, right? Now, we can look at all these. I've pulled these from a lot of different sources. We have things like the Ponemon Institute Cost of a Data Breach study. We have the M-Trend study. There's a bunch of things in here. And I don't really want to focus on the statistics in particular. We could talk about any of these particular statistics. But the reason why I wanted to bring all this, because you hear a lot of people talking about issues related to things like dwell time or breakout time or number of breaches and cost of data breaches and all this kind of fun stuff. And those are all really, really important to take a look at. And we can look at some of the ones that are here. CrowdStrike, global threat report, so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is there is one fundamental thing that we can look at for all of these. And it kind of boils down to that data breaches happen, right? They happen all of the time. And that sort of got me thinking. And we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail with this concept of data breaches happen. But the key thing that I wanted to kind of think about is if you think about how we tend to do security today, there are a lot of aspects related to security that as I kind of look at it, I'm kind of wondering if we haven't sort of given up on really solving the security problem. If you look at the popularity of topics that are covered when it comes to security training, security resources, security certifications, there's a ton of focus on things like penetration testing and red team. And so the question then becomes, why focus on penetration testing and red team? And the answer is really simple. And I'm not trying to discredit or downgrade anything related to pen testing or red team exercises. But it really boils down to, we have to do penetration testing, we have to do red team exercises, because we know we have problems protecting our environments from attack. We know that the bad guys are going to get in, and the only way we can figure out how to fix it is to attack ourselves and then try to figure out what holes to patch. And there's nothing wrong with that, but wouldn't it be better if we could just stop the bad guys to start with? Well, of course, and you might be saying that's not possible. Well, let's discuss that later. When we talk about things like digital forensics and incident response, we end up with a similar issue. Rather than saying, all right, let's stop the bad guys from causing us harm, we're basically going to say, all right, we know we're going to get hacked, so we need to make sure we train people to respond effectively to those breaches. Again, nothing wrong with it, but it sort of misses an important point, which I'll get to in just a little bit. Similar with cyber threat intelligence collection. Well, we got hacked. Let's see if we can learn about the attacker so that we can do a better job of preparing our defenses in the future. And then we have things like threat hunting, an incredibly popular thing these days, but it really boils down to, we know we are not going to detect bad guys on our network. Our detection and response is going to fail. So what we're going to do is proactively go onto our network and look for a bad guy who exists that we don't know they're there. If we go back to the previous slide, kind of looking at some of these numbers, in the very top middle, we talk about, this is from the Ponemon Institute, the 2022 Ponemon Institute Cost of a Data Breach Study. They talk about dwell time, or the mean time to identify, being 207 days. If we go down to the bottom left, we talk about the Mandiant FireEye M Trends report. They have their dwell time, median dwell time is 28 days. Now, that's a big difference, and people might be like, well, why is there a big difference between Ponemon and M Trends? My answer is, I don't care. I don't want the attackers on my network for 28 days before being detected, let alone 207 days. What's that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Who cares how long it is? Anything is too long.
And then when you contrast that with the CrowdStrike Global Threat Report, if we look at the bottom right, the breakout time, 84 minutes. That's basically the time that it takes an attacker to go from initial access to lateral movement in our organization. So the attacker is taking basically an hour or less than an hour and a half to start moving throughout our network. That means getting access, maintaining a level of access, potentially elevating privileges, kind of understanding the target network, and then lateral movement an hour and a half at an average, right? And all of this stuff is really, really, really bad. So again, as I said before, the overly obvious point, data breaches happen. Now, what in the world? So what? Like, what's the big deal? Well, it's kind of funny because I was literally, my wife and I just started watching a show that maybe you've seen before. It's called New Amsterdam. It's a medical drama, and it's kind of cool. Well, we literally watched an episode. We're in the first season. We watched an episode last night where, like, this picture right here is a scene from that, where the doctor on the right side here is talking to a patient. The patient says, "I feel dizzy." The doctor says, "What do you mean by dizzy? What does dizzy mean to you?" And there's a whole, backstory where the lady is like, dizzy is dizzy, whatever. It doesn't really matter. When all was said and done, the doctor finally got her to admit that, "I feel dizzy when I stand up. I feel like I'm going to fall over because it feels like my feet aren't there," right? Like that was what her description was. And the doctor went, "Oh, okay, because of that, you have this particular condition. We can treat it and life is good." Now, the reason why I brought that into this discussion is because when we're trying to solve a problem, the first thing we have to do is diagnose the problem correctly. We can't just treat the symptoms. I mean, that is a thing we could do, and that is actually a thing we do all the time. But if we want to truly solve the problem, we have to properly diagnose the issue. So let's get into properly diagnosing the issue. The first thing I want to talk about is we're going to talk about protective controls, the preventative measures we use to stop the bad guy from getting access to our networks. Now, I want you to think about how an attacker would launch their attack. And not in any kind of super technical detail. We could do that, but that's not really relevant. The way that I want you to think about this is when an attacker launches an attack, does it always work the first time? And the answer is, of course, no. But the problem that we run into is, the reason why it doesn't work is because the attacker oftentimes encounters protective controls, or at least that's one reason. So the attacker tries something, and a protective control successfully stops the attack. Awesome. Well, most organizations do not spend a lot of time investigating blocked attacks. We don't try to figure out who the attacker is. We just go, oh, our protective controls worked, next. Well, the problem that we run into in this particular case is that when the attacker tries their attack for the first time and it fails, they learn something about our protective controls. If nothing else, they have identified a technique that doesn't work. And there's nothing stopping the attacker coming back again and again and again and again. So the issue that we run into is the attacker can keep trying over and over and over again, and they only need to be right once. So the idea is we put our protective controls in place. Well, the bad guys will figure out a way to either circumvent, evade, avoid, or just simply, ignore and bypass that particular protective control. That's why I love this little picture right here of the gate across the road. And the fact of the matter is you can see all the car tracks where they just go around the gate. So that's how attackers work. They go down the road, they encounter the gate, they go, oh, let me figure out a way around that. So the idea that I want to get to is that protective controls generate resistance. And resistance equates to feedback for the attacker. That feedback is effectively intelligence, which allows the attacker to come back again and again and again. And every time they come back, they are more well-equipped. They are more informed. They are better at the attack. And then once they find a way through a protective control, they just repeat it for the next protective control and so on and so forth. So protective controls fail. In fact, there was a book written back, and I want to say it was like 1999, somewhere in that ballpark, by a gentleman named Win Schwartau called Time-Based Security. And in that book, he basically says that any of your protective controls, which could also be read as all of your protective controls, are subject to immediate and catastrophic failure, right? And the failure could be because you don't have a control at the right location, or you don't have something implemented properly. You could have a misconfiguration of the control. The control could have a vulnerability that allows the attacker to circumvent it. Or another common avenue for attack is the attacker compromises a valid identity and they use valid credentials and valid protocols, which typically will slice through a lot of protective controls. So the fact of the matter is we have to assume that our protective controls are going to fail. And we can back that up with decades worth of evidence. All of those statistics that I showed you before, they basically say, as we talked about before, data breaches happen. Now, the only way for data breaches to happen is either for an organization to have absolutely no controls whatsoever, which doesn't generally happen, or the attackers bypass those controls. So we know for a fact that protective controls fail because bad guys get in. That is a fact that is incontrovertible. So the fact of the matter is that when those controls work, they generate resistance. Resistance equals feedback. Feedback equals intelligence. And that intelligence means that the attacker will be better the next time. And that is just part and parcel to how protective controls work. So the idea here is, imagine this is going to be the worst game ever. It's the dumbest game ever. The idea is that we've got a game where there are 5 targets, 5 systems that we can go ahead and attempt to attack. Now, 4 of those 5 have properly implemented protective controls. 1 of those 5 has a vulnerability. It's been misconfigured or it's otherwise vulnerable to circumvention. Now, the deal is, in this environment, the layout of these systems does not change. So the attacker tries to attack computer 1, it fails. They try computer 2, it fails. They try computer 3, the attack fails. They skip over. They try computer 5, the attack fails. But when they try computer 4, the attack succeeds. And the fact of the matter is, that's kind of how attackers work. They try something, it fails. They don't try it again. They modify, they adjust. And so the fact of the matter is, in this game, the maximum number of moves to win is 5. And it might be as little as 1. And that's because our protective controls are static. And the other thing about our protective controls is they also tend to be uniform. What that means is, if I figure out a way to bypass or circumvent the EDR that is on one system, because you probably have that EDR on every system in your environment, I not only bypass one instance of that EDR, I bypass every instance of that EDR. So it becomes a numbers game. The attacker is destined to win because our environments are static, at least in the context of an individual attack, and they tend to be fairly uniform. So the attacker has the option of trying again and again and again. I actually went through just to kind of see how the numbers would play out, and I created some really simple shell scripts. So the idea of the shell script is, instead of 5 targets, I created 5 or simulated 500 attack vectors. Of those 500 attack vectors, only one of them is going to work. And then I ran this simulation through 10,000 times. And I just wanted to see kind of how it worked out. So in the first scenario, we ran basically 10,000 attempts, but the environment never changed, right? It was always the same environment. In that particular case, with the repeated attacks over and over and over and over again, I ran 10,000 attacks 100 times. And the average number of failed attacks was 462 out of 10,000. The average number of successful attacks was 9,538 out of 10,000. So the idea is, if you have a static environment where the attacker can learn from their mistakes, they can, once they figure it out, they figure it out. They don't need to try over and over and over again. I then did the exact same scenario, 100 instances of 10,000 attacks against 500 attack vectors. But every time I changed the environment, right? I modified which systems would be vulnerable, that kind of stuff. In that case, the average number of failed attacks was 9,989. The average number of successful attacks was 11. All this does is it goes to show that when our environments are static, when they do not change, the attacker can learn from their mistakes of the past and be better in the future. So the idea, and again, we're purely talking about protective controls. You might be saying, well, Kevin, what about detection? And that's what we're going to get to right now. Without detection, attackers will always eventually win. They will figure out our protective controls. They will evade, avoid, or circumvent those controls. They will gain access. They will elevate their permissions. They will then begin moving laterally in maybe an hour and a half or less. They will establish command and control, and then they will exfiltrate data or whatever else they wanted to do. This goes back to that super generic saying, protection is ideal, but detection is a must. Well, that's great, except for the fact that we now have to look at our detective controls and understand why they fail. And we know they fail because if you look at the M-Trends report, bad guys are on our network for 28 days on average before we detect them. And if we look at the Ponemon study, they're on our networks for 207 days. So obviously, our detection controls are also failing. So why do detective controls fail? Well, they fail for exactly the same reasons as protective controls. We could have missing detection. We could have misconfigured detection. Our detective controls can be evaded via a technological vulnerability, and the attacker can act like a legitimate authorized user. All of those things can provide an attacker with the means of interacting with our environments without getting caught. But it's worse when it comes to detection because I saw a study that showed that the average security operations center received 11,000 alerts per day. 11,000 alerts per day. That's like 4.6 alerts per minute.
That's
Maybe it's
shocking.
5.6.
It's
What's
not.
that?
It's not. That's shocking. It's not a big surprise, but it's still shocking.
Right. Well, and add to that the fact that, again, the same source said that the average alert takes about 10 minutes to interact with. Right? When an alert comes up, it takes SOC personnel 10 minutes to figure it out. If you get 11,000 alerts per day and it takes 10 minutes per alert to figure it out, it would take 228 8-hour shifts per day to look at every single alert. Right? It's not possible. Right? We also have this issue with false positives. Right? We have alerts. I saw reports that talk about as many as 1 out of 3 alerts on average is a false alarm. So we have this alert overload, this alert fatigue issue. The fact of the matter is 24/7 monitoring or alerting is problematic for most organizations because of this. 24/7 monitoring, right? You either need to build out and staff your own security operations center, right? And that's expensive. You need to contract with a managed security services provider to do monitoring for you. That's expensive. In theory, you could try to generate text message alerts every time an incident was identified. But at a rate of 11,000 per day, you can't do that. You'd be blowing up the phone of everybody who was supposed to respond. So we have this huge problem that even when our detection works, a lot of times that detection, that incident is missed in the noise of all of our detection environments. And in all honesty, we make this problem worse. A lot of detective technology boasts and brags about the number of alerts per day that they will generate, which to me is absolutely insane. And then when you add on to it that all of the security information ends up being distributed throughout our environment. Yes, sometimes we have centralized collection sources like SIM or XDR or whatever, but in a lot of cases, it's still not collecting everything. We might have full packet capture over here. We might have NetFlow data over there. We might have workstation logging over here. We have all these disparate sources of information. So the problem is, even when you do get a valid alert, you first of all have to confirm that it is actually an alert. Once you confirm it, you have to go try to figure it out, which means you have to go to disparate sources of information in order to try to respond effectively. And that increases the amount of time that it takes to effectively respond to an incident. And that ultimately increases data breach costs. So what do we do about this? Well, there is a really, really obvious answer to this problem. The answer is, and I'm talking about goals, right? Our goals, typically speaking, are we want to reduce false positives. We don't want to have a bunch of false alarms. We want to reduce false negatives, right? We want to catch everything bad that goes on. We want to decrease the alert volume to a manageable level and then automate wherever possible. We want to do a better job of more effectively detecting and then responding more quickly. And that automation piece is critical. Look at the volume of security technologies that focus on automating incident response, endpoint detection and response, identity threat detection and response, network detection and response, extended detection and response, managed detection and response. And then we don't have a DR, but we have the security orchestration, automation, and response. So the goal in all of these cases is to try to stop bad things from happening, detect bad things when they do happen, and then automate the response when we do detect something. And that seems like it would be a really awesome solution. But the question is, and I don't even ask the question, I'm going to tell you right now, if we succeeded at doing this, if we actually managed to generate 0 false positives, 0 false negatives, and virtually instantaneous incident response, we would destroy our security programs. Our security would become vastly weaker if we did that. Now, you might be saying, Kevin, what in the world are you talking about? Well, let's get to that. Assume that you detect a bad guy on your network. Okay. I don't care how long it took you. I don't care how long the attacker's been there. I'm saying if you detected a bad guy on your network right now, what do you do? And the only answer that we have today is you have to kick the attacker off. Now, you might be saying, well, no, Kevin, I'm going to watch the attacker so I can learn what they do. I can collect threat intelligence. I'm going to keep an eye on them. Well, the problem is that attackers have automation. Think of it this way. An attacker can cause catastrophic harm to your network at any moment. We don't necessarily know all of the areas where the attacker is kind of interacting with our network. So what is the liability if you detect a bad guy on your network and you knowingly allow them to stay on your network? And then in the time frame between detecting them and then eventually ejecting them, they do catastrophic harm, right? They do harm that hurts your customers. They do harm that hurts the business from a stockholder perspective, all that kind of stuff. There is absolutely no justification that you could come up with that says, well, yeah, we knew the attacker was there. We decided to leave them on our network so that we could learn, so that we could collect threat intelligence, whatever, and they destroyed our organization. That's what we cannot do. So we end up with a significant problem, right? Once we eject the attacker from our network, we have effectively burned what I will call actionable threat intelligence. Once the attacker is on our network, we at least know something about them. We know the IP address that they're coming from. If we kick them off, they can just leave and then come back with a different IP address and maybe even different tactics. But the bigger problem that we run into, if we actually detect and then eject the attacker, right? If all of our detection and response works perfectly, we have a massive problem. Think about it like this. The attacker performs action X. The attacker does something on our network. That action causes them to get detected and then ejected immediately. That's our goal, right? Rapid detection, rapid ejection. The attacker tries something, they get ejected. Guess what? They don't try that action again. So they come back with a different IP address and an increased knowledge of our security controls. In fact, if we have rapid detection and rapid response, we have turned our detection controls into protective controls. And therefore, we have the same problems that we talked about before. If we actually accomplished rapid attack detection and immediate ejection, then we no longer have detection. We are now back in a state where we are relying exclusively on protection. So the fact of the matter is the only reason detection works today is because we don't do it well. It takes us so long to detect bad guys on our network that by the time we do detect them, the attacker has no idea how they've gotten caught. But that's not a viable strategy. We can't say our intent is to just let attackers roam our network for a long period of time, and then once we detect them, we can kick them off without kind of providing the attacker with any kind of intelligence. So we have a fundamental problem that I don't think anybody's really paying attention to. And part of the reason is because today we don't really have the capability of doing super, super high fidelity detection and immediate response. So this is a problem that is associated with an end goal that we really haven't accomplished yet as an industry. But it's the direction that we're trying to go, and it creates a huge problem. So again, we have our same game here, but now instead of protective controls, we're going to talk about detective and instant response. But the fact of the matter is, it's the same game. If the attacker interacts with computer one and they immediately get detected and then ejected, it's the same thing as if they got blocked. the attacker still learns about our environment. They still gain an incredible advantage, and they can just keep trying over and over and over again. So the question is, how do we solve this problem, right? We can complain about it all we want. And the way that I'm looking at it is that there are 4 things that we need to have in our overall security architecture to actually solve this problem. And we're going to dig into each of these. The first one of those things is what I call high fidelity, low noise detection. We need to do a really good job of when a bad guy is on our network, we detect them relatively quickly or as quickly as possible, but we do so in such a way that if an alert is generated, we know it is a problem, right? We don't have to go investigate it. We don't have to spend 10 minutes or 10 hours trying to figure out what's going on. When that alert goes off, we know it's a problem. Now, the caveat to that is there's always the potential for some false positives. So I'm going to say when an alert goes off, I know it's a problem, or I can determine that it is not actually a problem very, very quickly. We'll dig into what I mean by that in a little bit. So we need high fidelity, low noise detection, right? And part of the reason why we need that is because if I told you that we're going to generate 11,000 alerts per day in a security operations center, there's not much you can actually do with that unless you had a huge staff of people. You can't, if you're a smaller organization, you can't send text messages to your incident handler every time an alert is generated. But what about if there was an alert, a specific type of alert, that when it went off, it's 95% likely to be a real big deal, right? Then, because the volume of those alerts is going to be much smaller, we can do real-time notification. We can send a text message to somebody and they can respond to it. So we need that. The other thing that we need is incident information, right? We need as much information as readily available as possible about a real incident so that we can do our incident response, our investigations, all of that in as timely a manner as possible. The next thing that we need are non-production resources. Now, you might be going, what in the world are you talking about there, non-production resources? Let's just put that on hold for a second, and I'll explain what that is in just a little bit. We're going to go into these in more detail. And then the last thing that we want is another thing that I'm not going to dig into quite yet, but I will save the surprise for later, which is environment variability. So my contention is if you put together high fidelity, low noise detection, incident information, non-production resources, and environment variability, you now have a strategy. So is there any room for honeypot in your security architecture? Abdul, thank you for asking that question. Just be patient. We will get there in just a couple of minutes. But that's an awesome, yes. The short answer is yes, and we'll get there in just a moment. So really, really awesome. So the fact of the matter, though, is all 4 of those elements are necessary in order to make this work. If we do not have ready and easy access to incident information, then our incident response process takes longer and our data breach costs go up. If we do not have high fidelity, low noise detection, then we end up with the same situation we're in right now. We get inundated with noise and we miss attacks. The non-production resources are kind of in the environment variability. Again, I'm going to get into those things in just a bit. So let's talk a little bit about each of these steps as we go through there. The first one is incident information. My contention is more is better. We have a ton of resources where we can get incident information within our environments. Everything from server logs, authentication and identity-related logs, application logs, firewall logs, heck, even workstation logs, endpoint security logs. Again, tons and tons and tons of information that's available. The problem isn't so much that we don't have information available. It's just sometimes hard to get access to. So my contention would be that wherever possible, your security information should be sent to a centralized location, whether that's a SIM solution, a syslog if necessary, an XDR solution, whatever it is, get as much of your incident and security information into a centralized location as you possibly can. Now, there will be some things that are going to be very hard to shove into a SIM, things like full packet capture and NetFlow data, but just try to reduce the number of panes of glass, if you will, that you need to look at in order to get incident information. Now, this is the least interesting part of this overall architecture because we're kind of already doing this stuff now. All right, the next one we have is high fidelity, low noise alerting. So in order to understand what I'm recommending here, we need to understand that security information falls into two broad categories, what I call monitoring or collected information, and then alerting. Monitoring is anything that is generated that is related to security, but that doesn't specify this is bad. So most of your server logs and workstation logs and network device logs, firewall logs, packet capture, network monitoring, all of those things collect valuable information and they allow us to add context to our investigation, but they don't say, hey, this is bad. They just sort of say this is, okay? Then we have alerting functions. An alerting function is anything that says this is bad, right? So IDS, IPS, certain logs, the output of analyzed SIM or XDR, like after the correlation, after the normalization, anything that says, hey, I detected something bad, potentially user and entity behavioral analytics, integrity verification, a file that shouldn't have been changed was changed, and we can incorporate deception technology into this category. So the first thing is we need to recognize and realize that alerting and monitoring are two completely different things. And I'm suggesting that we separate those. Now, when I say separate them, the logical way of describing that would be send your monitoring information to one location and your alerting to a different location. But you could also just use things like tagging, right? I don't really care how you differentiate, but the idea is we do not want general informational security logs that don't say anything about something bad happening to be mixed in with the alerts that say, warning, something really bad has actually happened. So that's sort of step number one in the process, but we want to take it a step further. We also need to understand that within the context of alerting, when an alert is generated, all alerts are not the same. So what I'm also suggesting is that we separate, at least logically, high fidelity alerts from low fidelity alerts. So a high fidelity alert, what am I defining that as? What I'm saying there is when an alert is generated, it is high fidelity if there is, let's just say, a 90 to 95% chance that there is actually a problem, that there is also minimal investigation required to confirm the problem. So the idea is I want to identify those alerts that get generated within my environment that when they go off, I know there's a problem. Now, in order to do that, we need to make some concessions. And the biggest concession that we're going to make is that when I look at high fidelity alerts, there will be false negatives. In other words, a valid attack that is launched against our environment might not show up in a high fidelity alert. And I don't care right now. We'll explain why in a second. So then what we're going to do is we are going to separate high fidelity alerts from low fidelity alerts. Okay. The low fidelity alerts get maybe logged into our SIM or our XDR solution. We operate on the low fidelity alerts in exactly the same way that we do it today. We have security operations center or incident response functions. We analyze our information. We look at the alerts. We investigate them. We determine whether or not it's a true alert or if it's a false positive. In other words, we operate exactly as we do today with the low fidelity alerts. We haven't lost anything. We have not decreased any capability that we have currently today. But when it comes to the high fidelity alerts, you have at very minimum a process differentiator. You have tagged or isolated the high fidelity alerts. So when those high fidelity alerts go off, you have a different process that involves immediate incident response, right? You are immediately getting somebody. There's no level 1 SOC analyst that figures it out, then they pass it on to a level 2. It is an immediate detect. Now, the advantage of this, particularly for smaller organizations, is that if you have identified the specific alerts that you categorize as high fidelity, now we can do 24/7 alerting or alert notification. I can now send a text message to my incident response person 24/7 and get them to respond effectively, because we're not going to generate 11,000 of these things per day. So the idea is that we can optimize our incident response. We can reduce our security operations center costs. We can allow smaller organizations to do 24/7 response. We have more effective incident response. And because we have more effective response, we also have lower breach costs. Now, understand that the volume of these high fidelity alerts is going to be very small, and that's okay. The idea, though, is think of it like this, right? If I've got a physical facility, okay, and I have an alert that if a window is broken, that it generates an alert, okay? That's a high fidelity alert. Now, yes, could it be a bird flew into the window? Sure. Could it be somebody threw a baseball accidentally through the window? Sure. How long is it going to take to figure that out? Virtually no time at all. But if the window is broken, I must respond. Now, contrast that. I have, for example, those Ring cameras at various places throughout my house. And those things go off when they detect motion. And in many cases, the motion might be somebody walking by my house, and I get an alert. Now, is it still an alert? Yes. Is it high fidelity? No, because there's a lot of false positives. So the idea is we can look at our alerting the same way, and we can adjust accordingly. Now, I could also adjust my Ring camera so that it only pays attention to the couple of feet right in front of my front door, which is fine, except in that case, if somebody goes near my front door, but they go to like the window that's next to my front door, I won't catch them. So we tend to get high fidelity. We tend to narrow the focus of our alerts, and that means we're going to miss things. But the approach here is we are not disregarding the low fidelity stuff. We're operating on that in exactly the same way that we always have, but we are simply identifying a subset of alerts that are specifically high fidelity, right? And by the way, when it comes to high fidelity alerts, yes, certain log entries could fall into that category. Certain results of SIM or XDR processing could fall into that. Deception technology, honeypots, as Abdul had said. If you have and this gets into our next topic of conversation, which we'll get to in just a second, but if you have somebody interact with a honeypot or a honey token, a honey database, or insert honey in front of something here, then that's a high fidelity alert. Integrity verification, right? If a file that is never supposed to change is changed, that's a high fidelity alert as well. Now that brings us into the next thing that we need. We need what we call our non-production resources. So what in the world am I talking about when I talk about a non-production resource? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It could be a server, a workstation, a network device, a printer, operational technology, industrial control systems, Internet of Things devices. It could be even on a given host, directories, files, credentials, services, applications. The key factor with all of these is they have no sort of normal production value. And because they're not used in normal production operations, that means any interaction or use of these non-production resources is by definition abnormal. The idea, though, is that these non-production resources look similar to production resources. So the attacker cannot readily tell the difference between non-production resources and production resources. So when they get on our network and they start moving laterally after less than an hour and a half, and they interact with any of our non-production resources, we have a high fidelity alert. We know that there is a problem because nobody should ever interact with these from a production perspective. Now, going back to that false positive deal, right? Could it be our security team that did a port scan or a vulnerability scan? Absolutely. But interaction with these non-production resources allows me to say, oh, this attack came from IP address 1.1.1.1. That's my security team. Let me just give them a quick call. oh yeah, we just did a port scan. Okay, we could eliminate that. It's the same as that bird crashing through a window or a baseball bat. We're going to get very few incorrect alerts, and the ones that we do get are going to be super easy to identify. But that's not the real reason we want non-production resources. It is super beneficial. And if that's the only reason that you use honeypots or deception technology or decoys or whatever term you want to use for those, if that's the only use case you have for them is detecting bad guy activity on your network, that's a huge, huge win. I am a giant fan. But architecturally, there is another issue. Remember, we talked about the fact that if a bad guy is on your production network, you have no choice but to immediately eject the bad guy. But what about if we have a non-production environment? I'm not saying you have a whole giant network. I'm saying, what if you have non-production resources that look like production resources, that act like production resources? From the attacker's perspective, these production resources meet their expectations. They look like what the attacker expects to see in your network. And even better, the non-production resources could be desirable by the attacker. They could have vulnerabilities that the attacker wants to take advantage of. They could be named in such a way that attracts the attention of the attacker. They could have certain services that attract the attention of the attacker. So if the attacker gets on the network and they see exactly what they expect to see, and some of the resources appear to be desirable, that's more likely where the attacker is going to go. If we then include references to the non-production resources on our production systems, we plant references in the ARP cache, the DNS cache, we put credentials in the LSAS process in memory to direct the attacker to the non-production resources. Now we have a way of shifting the attacker from production to non-production resources. But the key factor here is if the attacker is interacting with non-production resources, we now do not need to eject them immediately. We can allow the attacker to stay and play for a little while. We know they're there. We know what IP address they're coming from. We know what they're doing. If they started interacting with production resources, we could kick them off. Now, I'm not saying that we need to allow the attacker on indefinitely, but what it does allow us to do is to delay the ejection of the attacker so that when we finally do eject the attacker gains no intelligence about our controls. So by implementing non-production resources and letting the attacker play with them for a bit, we can eliminate the problem of turning our protective controls of turning our detective controls into protective controls and giving the attacker an advantage. The attacker can play with our non-production resources and we can eject them at any time we want. And oh, by the way, while they are playing with our non-production resources, we can also watch their behavior, collect environment-specific cyber threat intelligence without suffering the harm of a true breach. And that's where the value of non-production resources truly comes in from an overall architectural perspective. It allows us to do detection without giving up the intelligence about our detection scenario. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and this is a little bit more future state, has to do with environment variability. So we know that attackers learn from their past mistakes. So if every time the attacker comes back, they get the exact same environment, then they can just literally use what they learned in the last attack to make the next attack better. Now, if we have non-production resources, there's nothing stopping us from changing the names of those resources, the IP addresses of those resources, the open ports, the vulnerabilities, the listening services, the credentials, the MAC address, whatever. We can change anything we want about the non-production resources anytime we want with no problems. Now, obviously, when the attacker comes back, they see at least partially a different environment, and they're going to have to figure that out. Now, changing production resources is a little bit more challenging, right? There are some things that we could, in theory, do. You could use IP address variability, where you literally are changing the IP addresses of your production resources on a fairly regular basis, and then keeping that sort of synchronized with your DNS. You would have an internal DNS server that has a very low or a short time to live. And so you could literally change the IP addresses of your production systems and just make sure that DNS accounts for those change. Now, if the attacker attacks you using a fully qualified domain name instead of an IP address, that really doesn't help. But it's that idea that we're getting into the realm of what's often called moving target defense. Now, generally speaking, moving target defense is a fairly difficult and sophisticated thing to put in place. But before we end, and we're getting close to the end of this thing, I want to kind of throw out a scenario. And this is actually a project that I'm currently working on developing. And if it sounds interesting, I'll provide my contact information. Hit me up and I can go into more detail. So imagine here's a situation. Step number one, a high fidelity alert is detected. We know that something bad is going on. We're then going to extract from the high fidelity alert the IP address of the system that is involved in the attack. Now, this could be the external attacker's, the attacker's public external IP address, or if the attacker compromised an internal system, we can identify what that internal system is. So we now know if it's an internal IP address that there is a compromised internal system, or we have an attacker that's physically in our environment. If it's an external, we know where they're coming from. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to then broadcast out. I'm using broadcast generically, right? We are going to broadcast out the IP address that is known now to be malicious to all enforcement points in the environment. Now, what I'm working on from an enforcement perspective is host-based firewalls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the offending IP address to every production system on the network. The production system has a host-based firewall. I'm going to use that IP address to make new firewall rules that say, all right, if we have any packets that have a source IP address of the offending IP address, we're not going to block those traffic. What we're going to do is we are going to redirect. We're basically going to do a port level proxy to redirect the attacker's packets from the production system to what we call a high interaction decoy that looks like the production system. So the attacker they look at the production environment. They see that we have a production web server at IP address 1.1.1.1. It's listening on port 80 and port 443. That's real. That's production. The attacker then does something that gets them caught. The attacker then goes back and interacts with IP address 1.1.1.1. Everything that the attacker sees appears to be the same as it was before, except that in the background, the Windows firewall or the IP tables firewall, for example, is forwarding the packets to a decoy that looks similar to the production system, but contains no production data or no production code. The decoy responds back to the production system, which responds back to the attacker. So from the attacker's perspective, the production network has not changed at all. But the attacker is now being redirected to realistic decoys, and they never know it. So the instant that you get a high fidelity, low noise detect, we can now effectively make the production network vanish. And the theory is you could do this with network-based firewalls or any kind of other enforcement point incorporated into your zero trust kind of functionality. But the idea is that once a high-fidelity, low-noise detect happens, the automation is not to eject the attacker, but it's to change the entire environment from the perspective of the attacker. So the attacker believes they are continuing to interact with the production environment. They believe throughout the entire time that they are winning. In reality, we have completely redirected them, and they have absolutely no idea that this is going on. And if you put all of this stuff together, access to incident information, the non-production resources, the environment variability, and the high-fidelity, low-noise detection. If you architect your network to focus on those, then we have the capability of virtually eliminating any kind of post-detection malicious activity against our production network, or, as many of the resources as we can. And that's kind of the overall idea of what I'm calling a detection-oriented security architecture. So That's what I had to say. I've got a whole bunch of contact information here. We've got a few more minutes. I am happy to get any kind of questions that anybody has, any kind of feedback responses, or hit me up on any of these channels.
I'll also mention that I'll email everybody out all your contact info.
Oh, perfect.
Great presentation. What's the state of the project that you're working on? You were just talking about. Are you looking for people to help out and so forth?
So I am terrible at coding. I kind of know the concepts, but I'm really bad. So I'm trying to do this in the context of basically shell scripts or PowerShell scripts, even though I'm really bad at PowerShell. If somebody wants to help out with this, I would jump at the opportunity, right? If somebody's like, hey, I can help do this, we can do this with Python, or we can do this with C#, I don't care. But if anybody does think that this is now there are a lot of questions I have about how this approach would actually work in practice. So I'm actually trying to build out the environment. For example, I'm getting into like sort of application layer packet stuff. If I've already completed a TCP three-way handshake with the production system, and then suddenly I'm shunted off to the non-production system, I don't know yet what effect that's going to have from the perception of the attacker based on various application layer protocols. So, in other words, I don't want to create a situation where the attacker instantly becomes aware that they've been caught. So I've got to play around with this, but that's kind of the general thought process. Any words on AI tools like ChatGPT and how to control them in a corporate environment? I am only really now getting into ChatGPT. I will say the limitations that I find with ChatGPT, first of all, the last learning that it did was a couple of years ago, and it doesn't have any connection to the internet. So the real-time applicability may be somewhat questionable in terms of current real-time approaches. Now, there is a cool thing that I haven't played with yet, but I've started to install called Auto GPT, which is kind of a wrapper around ChatGPT that also has access. I think that those things could play a huge role. But the question then becomes, why are we using AI? In other words, I'm not saying it's a problem. I'm saying we need to identify exactly why we would want to use AI. The way that I would do it is I would try to use AI to help me automate the creation of the non-production decoys that when that environment variability happens, when you redirect the attacker's packets from a production to a non-production host, I'm thinking maybe AI could do a really good job of creating that non-production host that appears realistic and similar to production, but obviously isn't. And so I think there's some really cool stuff. ChatGPT 4.0 I supposedly has more update. Yeah, and that's so. I think that there's a definite role. I have started using ChatGPT all the time, just in terms of bouncing ideas back and forth and all that. I just don't know enough about it to be able to really give you a really good definitive answer.
We have a lot of questions on it. From my viewpoint, it's just going to be a tool that we use. It's not going to make amazing differences. Yeah. It's like when word processors came out. A lot of people saying, well, writers, it's like we don't need writers anymore because we've got word processors. And clearly that wasn't true.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a useful tool on both sides, both attack and defense.
Absolutely. And particularly, just a tool. Yeah, like that Auto GPT thing allows you to identify a particular goal. And what it does have, it coordinates internet access with ChatGPT and a couple other functions. So you can say, here's my goal, and it iterates through accomplishing that goal. So it identifies the steps that would be required to accomplish the goal. And then as it accomplishes those steps, it updates its own processing so that it's kind of a multi-layer ChatGPT type of thing with internet access. I just haven't gotten it. It's not the easiest thing to get up and running because you've got to install all kinds of like code stuff and all that. But yeah, I think it's pretty cool. What are your thoughts on premature ejection, where by immediately ejecting an attacker once you have detected them? Hold on, wait a second. Was detected them, return you secondary backdoor. Okay, so if I tried to read that pretty quickly so I wasn't boring everybody. So the idea is, all right, we detect a bad guy. We have a choice. If we detect the bad guy and we immediately eject them, right? then we end up with this problem of, well, what do I know about the bad guy? Where was the bad guy? How many systems did the bad guy? So this gets into sort of an incident response scoping exercise, trying to figure out how widespread was the attacker. And the only real answer that we have today is go into your incident response process. So we probably want to kick the bad guy off as quickly as possible, but then we also need to start hyper monitoring, and we need to start digging into our incident response process to go look for indicators of compromise across multiple systems in our production network, all of that kind of stuff. So that's just a mess. And that's why I kind of focus on the non-production resources, because I really don't want to allow attackers to stay on my network until I've answered all of the questions that I have, because if they interact with my production system, they can cause me catastrophic harm. So by having the non-production resources, that gives me the ability to kind of play around with the attacker without suffering that risk as we get in there. But yeah, that's the that's kind of the general approach. And yeah, so Robert, when you had posted there, that's really kind of the big problem that we have, is the longer we allow the attacker on our network, either knowing they're there or not, the more damage they can cause. But if we just kick them off, they can always come back. That's also where the environment variability comes in. So imagine that we implemented that solution that now is identified. So the attacker has compromised an end user computer, maybe through some phishing attack or a drive-by attack or watering hole attack. The attacker is on the end user's computer. So maybe from an architectural perspective, we've got an EDR platform that can now track where the public-facing IP address that attacker is coming from. We could see where the attacker moves as they interact with our non-production resources. So we get a ton of visibility into what's going on from an attacker's perspective. We could just kick them off. The attacker comes back with a different IP address using different techniques. But if we have all that information and we have the non-production resources, we can allow them to stay for a little while, figure out what they've done, kick them off, modify the environment with that environment variability thing. And when they come back, things are changed. So that's kind of the overall kind of approach we have. What are some open source tools for honeypots you recommend? I actually do not recommend, for the most part, open source honeypot tools. What I recommend is, if you actually want to create a honeypot, just use Docker containers or virtual machines. Just create a virtual machine that looks similar to your production systems, lock it down. You can use network access controls or host-based firewalls. The same thing can be said for Docker containers. Just create fairly realistic things like you would create anything else on your network. The problem with a lot of the open source tech, now there are a couple of cool things. There is an open source deception technology called Deja Vu out there. That is kind of an open source pseudo enterprise class. You could go ahead and take a look at that. I think it's called Deja Vu. But yes, but the easy way to do it, just create like a Docker container that has logging that goes and gets sent to a syslog or a SIM solution, something like that, or the same thing with a virtual machine. Non-production systems may imply a second set of software licenses, hardware. This cost seems like a solution for big organizations. You are correct there. Non-production does imply that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. For example, I can create fairly realistic non-production Windows systems by deploying Docker on a Windows computer and then generating Windows Docker instances. And I still only have one underlying operating system. So I might have to increase my licensing from a Windows perspective by a small amount, but I can utilize Docker to create at least somewhat realistic services that appear to be different IP addresses, different MAC addresses, different services, all that kind of stuff. So you can do it. By the way, there are commercial deception technology solutions out there as well that can also be implemented if you wanted to do that, that also minimize licensing requirements, all that. If an overambitious attacker doesn't realize they do not have anything. Yeah, exactly. So holding statements and social media statements around the topic of non-production, exfil, or fake database is necessary. Hold on, I'm getting to read this. Let me go. Holding statements and social media statements around the topic of non-production, exfil, or fake databases is necessary if an attempt to extort or besmirch. Okay, yeah. So that's where you end up having there is definitely a potential challenge there, right? Which is, all right, if I give the attacker access to systems that do appear to be production, which means they appear to have production data but don't, they extract that and then they say, hey, we're going to tell everybody how bad your security is by publishing your secret information. My answer is really simple. I'm going to get ahead of it. I'm going to say, we detected an attacker on our network. We redirected the attacker to a series of non-production resources. The attacker exfiltrated non-production, data, and they are now attempting to extort us. We have told them to go ahead. But if you see this data with these, I'd actually put it out there. Now, you might be saying, well, doesn't that tip off the fact that you are using non-production resources? Yes, it does. But what effect is that going to have on the attacker? If you're an attacker and you get into my environment, now you know I'm using this deception. I'm using non-production resources. So the question is, what do you do about it? Right? What is your avenue of attack? Because my production resources and my non-production resources don't obviously look different. So you only have three choices. One is you can ignore the fact that I'm using non-production resources or deception, in which case I'm going to catch you and I win. The other option is you say, this environment is too scary. I don't want to go here. And you leave and I win. The third option, you are a highly skilled, highly motivated, highly determined attacker. So what can you do? You slow your attack down to try to isolate the very small differences between production and the deception or the non-production resources. So what we've done at the worst case scenario is we have taken that breakout time from an hour and a half to probably many, 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 many days, because the attacker can't just blast stuff out there. They got to be hyper careful. And even in that circumstance, if the attacker, as sophisticated and skilled as they are, if they interact with a single deceptive resource, they are still caught. And there actually have been studies that show that this actually happens when attackers are there. They slow their attack down. Attackers thinking that there's deception are also going to avoid any overly vulnerable system because they think it's a trap, even if it's production. So if we have to let the world know that this is our architecture, it doesn't significantly degrade the effectiveness of the overall program. Cool. I think I got everybody's questions.
I think you got everything. We have a bunch of superb questions.
Yeah, it was awesome. So yeah, I mean, we're getting towards the end. I'm not seeing any other questions and all that. Like I said, Ted said he's going to shoot out my contact information. It's also on here. Hit me up. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter. I do have a YouTube channel called Take Back the Advantage. Admittedly, I haven't updated the YouTube channel all that often, but I am going to be expanding upon the topics that we covered here, among other things, on that YouTube channel within the next week or so. So you're going to start seeing more on that channel about how to do the things that we just talked about throughout this class. I've got a couple of business sites. I'm actually in the process of launching a new business. So the CDA Security and DeceptiveDefense.com are going to be transitioning away from those, but I figured I'd give you someplace to go look and a variety of email addresses. So it's been awesome. I thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to go through this. I really hope that you gained, if nothing else, a slightly different way of thinking about how we should do protection, detection, and response. And I truly believe that if we implement this architecture that I laid out, however you want to do it, if we implement this architecture, it truly allows us to gain an advantage over the attackers where we really don't have one right now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kevin. Everybody should be getting a link to a replay, even those of us that aren't here that signed up. And I know we're going to have people signing up for the next few days, probably week. So tell your friends to come take a look. They can still sign up and they'll get an automatic replay sent to them. I will, at some point within the next few days, send everyone all the contact information we have here too, in case you didn't get a screenshot or something like that.
Yeah, and Kevin, feel free. Yeah, if you have any questions that are like, hey, Kevin, would you mind jumping on a call so we can talk about this stuff one-on-one? Hit me up. I'd love to chat about it.
And I would definitely take advantage of Kevin's offer with that. So thanks. I look forward to running into you again in person. And if not, maybe we can do another one of these and go a little deeper on somewhere.
I'd love to.
Sometime in the future.
Got lots of ideas. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, everybody. And have a great rest of the day. Thanks, Kevin. This has been awesome.